The auditorium buzzed with excitement. It was the day of the high school graduation and families filled the seats, eagerly awaiting the moment their children would walk across the stage and receive their diplomas. Paul, dressed in his graduation gown, sat with his classmates, his eyes scanning the crowd for his family. His mother, Martina, waved at him from the front row, her face glowing with pride. He smiled back, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. But then, his smile faded as he saw someone else entering the room. His grandfather, Anthony, stood at the back of the auditorium, looking slightly out of place. He wasn't dressed like the other family members in their smart suits and dresses. Instead, Anthony wore his usual work clothes, a faded flannel shirt and worn-out boots, his hands rough from years of labor on the farm. Paul's heart sank as he saw a few heads turn toward his grandfather, whispering and exchanging puzzled glances. Paul shifted in his seat, suddenly feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. He had always been proud of his grandfather. Anthony was a good man, a hard-working man, but Paul couldn't help but feel embarrassed in that moment. This was his big day, the day he had worked so hard for, and he feared that his grandfather's appearance would draw unwanted attention. As Anthony made his way through the crowded rows, Paul noticed his friends looking at him with confused expressions. He quickly averted his gaze, trying to focus on the stage. But it was too late. The whispers had already begun. He felt a wave of discomfort wash over him, his excitement for the day starting to wane. Martina, seated beside him, noticed the change in his demeanor. She leaned in and whispered, "Your grandfather is here. Be proud, Paul. He's come all this way to see you." Paul nodded, but the unease lingered. As Anthony sat down in the seat Martina had saved for him, Paul couldn't help but glance over, seeing the stark difference between his grandfather and the well-dressed crowd around them. The knot in his stomach tightened. The ceremony began, and Paul tried to focus on the speeches, but his thoughts kept drifting back to his grandfather. He loved the man dearly, but in that moment, he wished Anthony had dressed differently, wished he could blend in with His friends were already murmuring to each other, stealing glances at the old man in the worn-out clothes. Paul felt the weight of their judgment, and it pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. The sound of applause broke his thoughts as the first graduate's name was called. Paul clapped along with the others, trying to shake off the growing discomfort, but the whispers lingered in his ears, like a constant reminder of his fears. As the ceremony continued, Paul's mind was far from the saintly. He couldn't help but replay the image of his grandfather walking into the auditorium in those old clothes. The whispers, the glances, each one felt like a judgment, not just of his grandfather, but of him. He was proud of everything his grandfather had done for him, all the sacrifices, but today, in front of his friends and their well-dressed families, he was torn. He glanced over at his group of friends. They were laughing and talking, seemingly unaware of Paul's internal struggle. One of them, Carlos, caught his eye and raised an eyebrow, nodding toward Anthony. Paul felt his face flush. He knew Carlos was curious, maybe even confused, about why his grandfather looked so out of place. Martina leaned over to him again, sensing his unease. "I know you're worried about what people think," she said softly. "But your grandfather is here because he loves you. He's proud of you, Paul." Paul wanted to believe her. He wanted to let go of the tension, but it was harder than he thought. The pressure of the moment weighed on him, and he felt torn between two worlds. In one, he wanted to be the proud grandson, to show his love and gratitude for the man who had raised him. In the other, he feared being judged by the polished, sophisticated crowd around him. The speeches droned on, but Paul barely heard them. His mind was consumed with thoughts of his grandfather. He knew what Anthony had sacrificed for him, years of hard work, giving up his own dreams so that Paul could pursue his. But now, as he sat in the middle of this grand ceremony, Paul couldn't help but wish that Anthony had made a different choice that morning. A choice that would make Paul's day easier, that would spare him from the judgmental looks of his peers. The knot in his stomach tightened again, and he clenched his fists under his gown. He felt guilty for even thinking this way. This was the man who had given him everything, who had worked tirelessly so that Paul could have opportunities he never had, and yet Paul's heart ached with embarrassment, torn between pride and shame. He took a deep breath and tried to push the thoughts away. He reminded himself of all the good his grandfather had done for him, how he had always been there, no matter what. But the whispers in the auditorium wouldn't stop, and Paul couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that, somehow, he was being judged too. The applause rang out again as another student's name was called, but Paul's thoughts were miles away. He glanced at Anthony once more, seeing the quiet pride in his eyes. The guilt gnawed at him, but so did the fear of being misunderstood by everyone else around him. As the ceremony moved forward, the list of graduates being called seemed endless. Each name echoed through the large auditorium, followed by rounds of applause and cheers. But Martina wasn't focused on the stage or the celebration. Her eyes were on her son, Paul, who sat stiffly beside her, his gaze fixed forward, yet distant. She knew her son better than anyone. Paul had always been sensitive, deeply aware of how others perceived him, sometimes to a fault. He cared about doing the right thing, about standing out in all the best ways, but she also knew how easily he could be weighed down by the opinions of others. Martina could feel the tension rolling off him in waves, his posture rigid, his hands gripping the edges of his chair. She sighed quietly, her heart aching for him. Today should have been a day of pure pride. Paul was the first in their family to graduate from high school, a monumental achievement considering everything they had been through. She had hoped that for just one day, he could let go of his worries and fully embrace the pride and love that his family felt for him. But she could tell by the way he kept sneaking glances at his grandfather that Paul wasn't fully present in the moment. Anthony, her father, sat quietly beside her, hands resting in his lap, his gaze fixed on the stage as if nothing else in the world mattered. Martina admired his calm demeanor, the quiet strength he exuded. He had always been this way, steady, dependable, unshakable. Anthony had lived through so much and sacrificed even more, yet never once had he complained. She knew the weight of his life, the sacrifices he had made, not just for her, but for Paul, and yet he had carried that burden with grace. He had become both father and grandfather, raising Paul with the same love and dedication that had defined his life. Anthony had worked long hours on the farm, often coming home late at night covered in dirt and sweat, just to ensure Paul had the opportunities that he himself never had. And now, as Paul sat there, clearly embarrassed by the way his grandfather looked compared to the other guests, Martina's heart sank. She leaned over, placing a hand gently on Paul's arm. "I know you're feeling a lot right now," she said softly, her voice low enough so as not to draw attention. "But you need to remember something. This day isn't just about appearances. It's about the journey that brought you here, and no one has been more a part of that journey than your grandfather." Paul turned to look at her, his eyes filled with conflicting emotions. He wanted to be proud, of himself, of his family, but the stares and whispers from the crowd felt like needles digging into his skin. He had spent countless nights studying while his grandfather worked late into the evening to provide for them. Anthony had been there for every achievement, every setback, every moment that mattered. Paul knew this, but knowing didn't make the whispers any quieter, didn't make the stares any less. Martina tightened her grip on Paul's arm, her voice softening even more. "Your grandfather is the reason you're here today. Never forget that. Don't let other people's opinions cloud your heart." Paul swallowed hard, nodding slightly. Her words made sense. He understood what she was saying, but the discomfort lingered. His mind was still tangled in the embarrassment, unable to shake the weight of the moment. It was as if he were stuck in a battle between the pride he felt for his grandfather and the shame that came from how different they appeared from the others. Martina watched him carefully, giving him a moment to process what she had said. She had always taught Paul that family was everything, that no matter what life threw at them, they faced it together. But now, seeing him so conflicted, she realized that this was one of those moments where he had to learn for himself. She could guide him, but he had to come to the understanding on his own. Still, it didn't stop her from wanting to shield him from the hurt she knew he was feeling. Looking at her father, who sat silently, his eyes still on the stage. Martina felt a pang of sadness. Anthony had no idea the turmoil his grandson was going through. He was here simply to celebrate Paul's achievements, his heart filled with pride, completely unaware of the stares or whispers that were happening around him, and perhaps in some way that made it even harder for Paul. She wished she could ease Paul's anxiety, wished she could somehow show him that none of it mattered, that the whispers were meaningless compared to the love and sacrifice that had gotten him here. But as much as she tried, the decision to let go of those insecurities was something Paul had to make on his own. Paul's gaze wandered around the auditorium once again, unable to focus on the ceremony unfolding in front of him. The polished families, the elegant dresses, the tailored suits, it all seemed so far removed from the world he had grown up in. He felt out of place, like a stranger in his own celebration. His grandfather, sitting beside him in his work clothes, was a stark contrast to the neatly dressed parents and grandparents filling the seats around them. The whispers seemed louder now, though Paul couldn't tell if they were real or just in his head. His mind played tricks on him, amplifying every small sound, every glance, every flicker of movement as if the entire auditorium was watching them. It felt suffocating. He glanced over at his friends, seated a few rows ahead. Carlos, one of his closest friends since elementary school, caught his eye again and tilted his head toward Anthony, a look of mild confusion on his face. Paul felt his chest tighten, a familiar pang of dread settling in. He could imagine the questions swirling in Carlos's mind, and he dreaded the teasing that might follow after the ceremony. Would Carlos ask why his grandfather didn't dress like the others? Would he make jokes, the way he always did, harmless on the surface but cutting deeper than anyone realized? Paul shifted in his seat, the knot in his stomach growing tighter with each passing second. He had always been proud of his grandfather's hard work, his determination, and his resilience. But now, under the scrutinizing eyes of his classmates, that pride felt tainted, mixed with an overwhelming sense of shame that he couldn't shake. He hated himself for feeling this way, hated that he was allowing other people's opinions to affect how he saw his own family. But the whispers, the stares, they were relentless, and no matter how much he tried to push them out of his mind, they clawed their way back in, louder and more suffocating than before. Behind him, a group of girls whispered to each other, their voices low but audible enough to reach Paul's ears. He didn't have to turn around to know they were talking about him. He could feel their eyes on him, could sense the judgment in their glances. They were probably wondering why his grandfather didn't look like everyone else's, why Paul, who had always been one of the top students, came from such humble beginnings. The heat rose in Paul's face, his cheeks burning with embarrassment. Every look, every whisper felt like a judgment, and it was crushing him under its weight. His heart raced as he wondered what they were saying. Were they mocking him? Were they pitying him? The thought was unbearable. Martina, ever attuned to her son's feelings, placed her hand on Paul's arm again, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Let them talk," she said softly, her voice calm and steady. "None of it matters. What matters is what's in here." She pointed to her heart, her eyes filled with undie. "And you know your grandfather has more love and pride for you than anyone else in this room." Paul nodded, his eyes dropping to his hands, but her words did little to ease the anxiety gnawing at him. His mother was right, of course. He knew that. But knowing didn't make the whispers go away. Knowing didn't erase the sting of feeling like he didn't belong. The name of another student echoed through the auditorium, followed by a round of applause. Paul clapped along mechanically, his mind elsewhere, counting down the minutes until this ceremony would be over. But even then, he wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next. What would his friends say? Would they laugh at him? Would they understand? Paul tried to focus on the stage to lose himself in the rhythm of the ceremony, but the tension between pride and shame was too much to bear. Every time he thought he had pushed the feelings down, they came roaring back, stronger than before. He kept glancing at his grandfather, who sat silently beside him, unaware of the storm raging inside Paul's heart. Anthony was here for him, completely oblivious to the whispers, the stares, the judgment that weighed so heavily on Paul's shoulders. And yet, despite everything, Paul knew deep down that his grandfather's presence meant more than any whisper or judgment. Anthony had worked his whole life to give Paul this opportunity, to see him walk across that stage and accept his diploma. Paul knew that, understood it on a level that went beyond the superficial, but that didn't make it any easier to face the reality of the moment. The ceremony dragged on, with each student's name being called one by one. Paul could barely focus on the applause and cheers that followed each announcement. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: pride, shame, fear, and confusion, all tangled up inside him. He kept glancing at his grandfather, who sat quietly, watching the ceremony unfold with patient ease. Paul wished he could see the event through his grandfather's perspective, free from the judgment and whispers that haunted him. Then finally, the moment came. The principal stepped up to the microphone and cleared his throat. "And now, Paul Cardoso," the principal announced, "for his outstanding academic achievements." Paul froze for a moment, the sound of his own name jolting him out of his thoughts. His heart raced as the applause erupted around him. It was his turn to stand, to walk across the stage and receive the diploma he had worked so hard for. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. As Paul stood up, he felt the eyes of the entire auditorium on him. His friends cheered from the front rows, but all Paul could think about was his grandfather. He glanced toward Anthony, who had risen to his feet, his face beaming with pride. Paul's throat tightened, his legs feeling suddenly heavy. The whispers seemed to grow louder as Paul made his way to the stage. He could feel the weight of every gaze, every judgment, pressing down on him like a physical burden. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the podium. But then, something unexpected happened. Anthony, standing up from his seat, took a step forward. Paul's heart skipped a beat as he realized his grandfather wasn't just watching, he was walking toward the stage too. The auditorium fell silent as Anthony approached Paul froze, his pulse racing. What was his grandfather doing? Anthony cleared his throat, his voice slightly shaky but filled with resolve. "If I could," he said, "I'd like to say a few words about my grandson." The principal hesitated for a moment, glancing at Paul, but then he nodded and stepped aside, allowing Anthony to take the microphone. Paul stood there, stunned, unsure of what was about to happen. Anthony looked out at the audience, his weathered hands gripping the sides of the podium. "I know I don't look like the other grandparents here today," he began, his voice steady but soft. "I'm not dressed like you might expect, but that's because these are the clothes I wore when I gave up my own dreams, so that Paul could have his." The silence in the room was deafening. Paul's breath caught in his throat as his grandfather continued. "I've worked my whole life on a farm," Anthony said, his eyes scanning the audience. "I never had the chance to go to school or wear a fancy suit, but I kept these clothes, these very clothes, as a reminder of the day I put my grandson's future above my own. And today, as he stands here, I wear them with pride, because Paul has achieved something I never could." The weight of Anthony's words hung in the air, and Paul could feel the shift in the room. The whispers stopped. The judgment faded. All that remained was the powerful truth of his grandfather's sacrifice. Tears welled up in Paul's eyes as he listened, the knot in his stomach dissolving into something warmer, something that felt like pride. He had always known how hard his grandfather had worked for him, but hearing it spoken aloud in front of everyone was a moment that he would never forget. The auditorium was completely still. Every person in the room was hanging on to Anthony's words, the weight of his story touching each one of them in ways they hadn't expected. Paul could feel the shift in the air, the transformation that had taken place. No longer was he just a boy ashamed of his humble beginnings. He was now the proud grandson of a man who had sacrificed everything to give him the life he had. "I never cared about fancy clothes or high-paying jobs," Anthony continued, his voice soft but unwavering. "What mattered to me was that my grandson had a chance to live the life I never could. I worked these hands," he held up his calloused, weathered palms, "to the bone, because I wanted Paul to have this day. And now I see him standing here, and I know that all of it was worth it." Paul felt his chest swell with pride as he listened to his grandfather speak. The shame he had felt just moments before was gone, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude and love. He no longer cared about what his friends or classmates thought. All that mattered was the bond he shared with his grandfather, the man who had given him everything. When Anthony finished speaking, he turned to Paul, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm proud of you, Paul," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "More than you'll ever know." Paul couldn't hold back any longer. He stepped forward and embraced his grandfather, holding him tightly as the weight of the moment crashed over him. The audience erupted into applause, but Paul barely heard it. All he could feel was the warmth of his grandfather's arms around him, the love and pride radiating between them. For the first time that day, Paul felt free. Free from the judgment of others, free from the expectations he had placed on himself. He had spent so long worrying about what people would think, but in the end none of that mattered. His grandfather's words had cut through all of that noise, leaving only the truth. The love and sacrifice that had brought Paul to this moment. As Paul and Anthony stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the applause swelled around them. People were on their feet, clapping, wiping away tears, moved by the raw emotion of the scene unfolding before them. Martina, sitting in the front row, wiped at her own eyes, her heart full. She had always known how much her father had done for Paul, but seeing the two of them together on that stage, sharing this moment, was something beyond words. The applause echoed throughout the auditorium, louder than Paul had ever heard. But in that moment, all the noise seemed distant, like it was coming from another world. He stood there on the stage, holding his grandfather close, feeling the warmth of his embrace, the strength of his calloused hands gently patting his back. For the first time that day, Paul wasn't worried about the eyes on him, the whispers, or the judgment. None of it mattered anymore. As they broke the embrace, Paul looked into Anthony's tear-filled eyes, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. His grandfather had done so much more than raise him. He had sacrificed everything, his dreams, his comfort, and even his dignity, all for Paul. The shame Paul had felt earlier now seemed so small, so insignificant compared to the immense love that radiated from his grandfather. The principal, visibly moved, stepped forward to continue the ceremony, but not before offering a nod of respect to Anthony. "What a beautiful reminder," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Today is not just about accomplishments, but about the journey that brought each of these students here, and the sacrifices made along the way." Paul looked out into the crowd. His friends, who earlier had been whispering and casting sideways glances, were now on their feet, applauding along with every O. Carlos, the same friend who had raised an eyebrow at Anthony earlier, now had a look of admiration on his face. Paul could see the change in them all. No one was laughing or judging anymore. They had all been touched by his grandfather's words, just as Paul had. Martina wiped away her tears, her smile wide with pride. She had always believed in the strength of her father, but seeing him honored in such a public way brought a new level of pride. Paul, standing on that stage with his diploma in hand and his grandfather by his side, was the culmination of everything Anthony had worked for. And now, it felt like the entire world understood that. Paul gave his grandfather one last squeeze of the hand before stepping forward to receive his diploma. The weight of the paper felt different now, heavier perhaps, but in the best possible way. He walked back to his seat with his head held high, no longer burdened by the shame that had clouded his. The rest of the ceremony felt like a blur. Names were called, applause filled the air, but Paul's mind was elsewhere, reflecting on everything that had just unfolded. He couldn't stop thinking about his grandfather's words, the quiet dignity with which he had spoken, the strength in his voice as he shared the story of his sacrifice. Paul had always known on some level what Anthony had done for him, but hearing it said aloud, in front of all those people, had brought it into sharper focus. When the final name was called and the last student had crossed the stage, the graduates were asked to rise one last time for a collective round of applause. Paul stood tall, feeling lighter than he had all day. The knot that had twisted in his stomach throughout the ceremony was gone, replaced by a warmth that spread through his chest. As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, Paul felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Carlos standing there, his usual smirk replaced with a, "Your grandfather is something else, man," Carlos said, his voice filled with respect. "I didn't get it at first, but after hearing him speak, I don't know. It just hit me, you know?" Paul nodded, feeling a surge of pride. "Yeah," he said softly. "He's always been there for me." Carlos smiled again and patted Paul's back. "You're lucky, man." Paul watched as Carlos walked off to join his own family, and for the first time that day, he realized that Carlos had always been on his side. The teasing, the raised eyebrows, it was never out of malice. His friends had been curious, maybe even confused, but in the end they understood. They saw what Paul saw now, the incredible strength and love that had carried him through life. Martina approached, her face still wet with tears, but her smile brighter than ever. "I told you," she said, wrapping her arms around Paul in a tight hug. "I told you none of it mattered. You made your grandfather proud today." Paul hugged his mother back, feeling the weight of her words sink in. She was right. None of it mattered. The whispers, the stares, the judgment, all of it had faded away the moment Anthony had taken that microphone. What mattered was the love and pride that his family had for him, and that he had for them. When Anthony finally approached, Paul felt his heart swell. The man who had seemed so out of place at the start of the ceremony now felt like the most important person in the room. Paul stepped forward and hugged his grandfather again, this time with no hesitation, no fear of what others might think. "I'm sorry," Paul whispered into his grandfather's ear, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry I ever felt ashamed." Anthony pulled back and looked at his grandson with the same quiet wisdom he had always carried. "There's nothing to be sorry for," he said softly. "I've always known you were proud of me, Paul. And today, I'm more proud of you than I've ever been." They stood there for a moment, the two of them, surrounded by the noise and movement of the dispersing crowd. But in that moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the room. Everything else had faded away. As the three of them, Paul, Anthony, and Martina, walked toward the exit together, Paul felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. His grandfather had given him everything, not just the education and opportunities, but the strength to face the world without fear of judgment. And now, as they left the auditorium, Paul knew that no matter what came next, he was ready for it. He had always thought this day would be about him and his accomplishments. But in the end, it wasn't just his day, it was theirs. Don't forget to subscribe for more content. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like, it really helps out. I love hearing your thoughts, so drop a comment below. Your feedback means a lot to me. Stay tuned for more updates. Take care, and see you next time.